Okay, so we always hear about these, big global companies that are like rushing into India, right? Because it's this huge market. But what happens when a big Indian company, uh, a name we all know, decides to come back to its roots, like fully?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And it's something we're seeing more and more of these days, right? Like these big Indian companies kind of coming back home.
And that's what we're going to deep dive into today, right? Because Dream11, a company that's practically synonymous with fantasy sports in India,
Hmm.
well, their parent company, Dream Sports Inc., they've just moved their legal home, what we call domicile, from the U.S. back to India.
Exactly. It's a major move, and it's not just about paperwork either. Dream11 themselves are calling this a ghar waapsi, which translates to homecoming in Hindi. It really emphasizes that this is a meaningful return for them.
Yeah, it's like a real statement, right? And the sources we've been digging through, they show just how significant this Garwaxi really is.
Yeah.
So how do they actually make this happen legally?
Well, it's actually quite clever. They use what's called a reverse merger, where their Indian subsidiary, Sporta Technologies Private Limited, which operates Dream11 in India, merged with the U.S. parent company Dream Sports Inc.
Okay, so the Indian arm basically absorbed the parent company.
Hmm.
Interesting. And the sources point to Section 233 of the Companies Act of 2013 as the legal mechanism they use for this. And apparently this allows for something called a fast-track reverse merger, which is kind of a mouthful.
Yeah, it is, but it's basically a way to speed up the process. In normal mergers, you need approval from the National Company Law Tribunal, or NCLT, but this fast-track route lets them bypass that.
So they can basically sidestep a whole layer of bureaucracy. That's
Yeah.
pretty efficient.
Yeah.
But they still needed approval from somewhere, right?
Oh, absolutely. They
That's
still needed the green light from the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, since this involves, international financial transactions. And we know from some filings that the board of Dream11 India, they'd actually already approved this merger back in January. So this has been in the works for a while now.
So it's not like a spur-of-the-moment thing, right? And to be clear, what this all means is that all the shares of Dream Sports Inc., they're now being transferred to Sporta Technologies Private Limited. So it's like a complete flip, right? The Indian arm is now at the top of the structure.
Exactly. It's a total reshuffling and puts the Indian entity firmly in control. But, we can't talk about this move without considering the current landscape in India, especially when it comes to regulations, particularly around taxes.
Right, because the timing of this Garwapsi is pretty interesting given all the recent developments with the goods and services tax, or GST, especially for the online gaming sector.
Absolutely. It's definitely a factor to consider. I mean, we've seen the Directorate General of Goods and Services Tax Intelligence, or DGGI, slap Dream11 and other gaming platforms with massive demand notices.
We're talking about something like a mind-boggling 1.12 lakh crore rupees,
Mhm.
right? That's an enormous amount of money.
It is, and the core of the issue lies in how the GST is being calculated. Before, these platforms paid an 18% tax on their revenue, which is fairly standard. But now the DGGI is saying they should be paying a 28% tax not on the revenue, but on the total amount of money that players deposit on these platforms.
Instead of taxing just the profits, they're taxing the entire pool of money being wagered. That's a huge difference.
Exactly. And that's why these demand notices are so massive. It's a fundamental shift in how the tax is being applied.
Mm.
And of course, this has created a lot of uncertainty for the entire industry.
Yeah, the sources mention that the Supreme Court of India has stepped in and granted a temporary stay on these GST notices. So it's a developing situation with potentially huge implications for Dream11 and all these gaming companies.
Absolutely. And while Dream11 hasn't said outright that the GST issue is the main reason for their move back to India, it's hard to imagine it's not a major factor in their thinking.
Right. It makes you wonder if being domiciled in India might give them some advantages when it comes to navigating these regulatory challenges. But let's look at how Dream11 has been doing business-wise.
Well, for the fiscal year ending in March 2023, they reported a whopping 6,384 crore rupees in revenue. That's a 66% jump year on year. Plus, they turned a profit of 188 crore rupees, which is impressive given, the current economic climate.
That's pretty phenomenal growth and profitability. It shows that they're doing something right, even with all the regulatory uncertainty surrounding them. Of course, the sources also point out that we haven't seen their financials for the latest fiscal year FY24, so we don't have the full picture yet, but still very impressive numbers.
Definitely. And what's even more interesting is that Dream11 isn't the only one doing this. We're seeing a whole wave of Indian tech companies that initially set up shop overseas now choosing to come back home.
Yeah, it's like a reverse brain drain. It's becoming quite a trend. And the sources highlight several other big names that have already made this move, like Zepto, and PhonePe.
Exactly. And there are whispers that even more companies like Flipkart, Credit B, Pine Labs, Razorpay, and Meesho are all working on similar reverse flips. It's a pretty significant shift.
So what's driving this trend? Why are all these successful Indian tech companies deciding that India is the place to be?
Well, one big factor is simply the massive potential of the Indian market. It's one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and being headquartered here can give companies a real strategic edge.
Makes sense. I mean, being closer to your customers and having a better understanding of the local market can be incredibly valuable. And maybe there's also a sense of national pride at play, right? Indian companies wanting to be part of India's growth story.
Yeah, definitely. There's a real feeling of made in India gaining momentum. And of course, we can't forget about the regulatory environment. While it can be complex, being based in India might give companies a better chance of navigating the rules and building relationships with key decision makers.
Right? It's like you said earlier about the GST issue. Being domiciled in India could potentially help companies have a stronger voice in shaping these policies and regulations. And, Dream11 specifically mentioned their goal of leveraging tech to unlock the massive potential of India's sports ecosystem that really emphasizes their commitment to the Indian market.
Absolutely. And by being domiciled here, they're signaling that they're fully invested in India's future. It's a way of saying, we're here for the long haul.
So to sum up our deep dive today, we've seen how Dream11, a major player in India's online fantasy sports scene, has made a significant move. They've brought their legal home back to India using a fast-track reverse merger. This happened amidst a backdrop of regulatory changes, especially regarding GST, which, although not explicitly stated by the company, could be a motivating factor for this shift. And Dream11's not alone in this. A whole bunch of other Indian tech giants are making similar moves back to their roots.
Exactly. It's a trend that really highlights the growing maturity and appeal of the Indian market. These companies, having achieved success on a global stage, are now finding that India offers the best opportunities for future growth.
It's like a full circle moment, right? From Indian startups looking to make it big abroad to global players now choosing India as their home base. And that brings us to a thought-provoking question for you, our listeners. Given this trend of companies bringing their domicile back to India, what other major players, particularly in the tech sector, do you think might follow suit in the coming years? Which companies with a large presence in India might decide that having their legal base here is the best way to tap into the country's vast potential? It's a fascinating trend to watch, and one that could have major implications for the future of the global tech landscape.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic situation, and it'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Indian tech, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.